Title of our final session is Revisioning a Different Culture Towards a Culture of Peace. Let's look once again at violence and religion. Modern Irish history, and by that we mean history from the 1600s to the present, has been dominated by violence. Geopolitically, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in all of recorded human history. And Ireland reflected much of this bloodletting in continuity with the previous 3 centuries of violence and atrocity on this island. It seems that in the words of Richard Kearney, we have always killed each other in Ireland and killed each other for religious reasons, at least in part. Or the killing has been given some kind of religious legitimation. Now, secular humanists, in the face of this, find it easy to use the God dimension as a big stick. But it is also naive to ignore the bloody killing and atrocity also carried out in the 20th century by secular atheistic regimes. Stalin, Pol Pot and Mao were not religious cranks or even devout believers. There is one bizarre episode, though, from the Second World War. Before leaving with its atomic payload for Hiroshima, the American bomber was blessed by the Lutheran and Catholic chaplains, something that strikes me as a rather strange form of ecumenism. Here we are nearly 7 decades since Vatican II, and Catholic and Protestant cannot still officially share the Eucharist together. Supposedly, this is part of the pain of ecumenism and our ecumenical journey. But not to share the remembrance of the victim of imperial violence and state execution and military might. And yet, ecumenically bless weapons of mass destruction is surely theological nonsense, to put it mildly. The foundational documents of Northern Ireland and the Republic, often seen as iconic documents, the Ulster Covenant and the Easter Proclamation, both invoked violence and God as core. God authorised in both documents the gun in politics. Blood sacrifice was at the heart of the Easter Rising, and blood sacrifice was also at the heart of the 36th Ulster Division's understanding of its loss of life at the Battle of the Somme, also in 1916. And the blood sacrifice ideology or theology was rooted in Catholic Eucharistic theology on the one hand and Protestant evangelical atonement theology on the other. And so we describe war, violence, or dying in action or for a cause as a supreme sacrifice. We clothe it in religious language, and somehow the religious veneer justifies it, gives it heroic status, even sacred status.
We're now going to look at a Christology of non-violence and peace building. At the heart of the Christian faith is Christology, which is about how we talk of Jesus. Much of Jesus' life and activity was focused on the praxis of non-violence and peace building. If these ethics were so central to what Jesus is about, then in the context of a pervasive culture of violence which has been legitimated by religion, which Jesus is being represented? Is it the warrior Jesus whose blood sacrifice required by God inspires our blood sacrifice in war and civil violence? And is this Jesus even Christian? It is something of a puzzle, to say the least, that non-violent and peace-building Christologies have never become the dominant voice of Western Christendom. Yet, if Jesus is the story that forms the Church, then Church is to live out its normative and formative story of Christ's active non-violence and peace-building. There are a number of activities essential to the praxis of Jesus in the Gospels. Healings were one of Jesus' key activities and are performed as acts of reconciliation and also signs of God's reign. Mark's Gospel has many exorcisms and healings. These are set in the context of the violent, oppressive Roman Empire. but healing runs counter to the destructive domination system. These healing miracles reveal God's alternative empire in which violence is rejected and reconciliation and wholeness are realised. Jesus also spent a lot of time hosting dinner parties. In fact, his controversial dinner parties distinguished the Jesus movement and its leaders from other groups in Judaism. They were controversial parties because of their radical inclusive guest lists. Jesus partied with tax collectors on the Roman payroll and sinners. It was this inclusive guest list that deeply offended the religious and cultural gatekeepers. The inclusive hospitality was an important sign of the reign of God, a living out of God's reign or alternative empire. Jesus will not exclude, he will not marginalise or even write off anyone as unclean. The table must include the enemy. This imagery is already present in a much earlier ancient poem from Jewish tradition, the familiar 23rd Psalm, where enemies are included around the table. The essence of the teaching of Jesus is found in the Sermon on the Mount, and the quintessence is especially found in the Beatitudes. These elucidate Jesus' practice of active non-violence, which includes not resisting evil violently, and love of the enemy, and all of this in the context of Roman imperial rule. And this, for Jesus, represents the high water mark of his ethics. Jesus' active non-violence is seen in the conflict stories in Mark's Gospel and is clearest in the story of Jesus' trial and death. The irony is that the event used by Christians to provide war and violence with its language of blood sacrifice and supreme sacrifice is Jesus' active non-violent response to a violent and brutal imperial system. The historical nature of the cross of Jesus has often been obscured by much later theories about Jesus' death. Another starting point for understanding the death of Jesus needs to begin with its first-century historical context. The cross was an act of state violence, in the face of which Jesus neither spoke nor acted violently. From the perspective of Jesus and God, it was a demonstration of merciful love, active non-violence, and forgiveness of enemies. It wasn't passive. Rather, Jesus resisted the evil of violence by active non-violent love and reconciliation. Jesus, therefore, transforms the violence of the world and opens up a new way of relating, solidarity with the poor and suffering, the practice of generosity and forgiveness, love of the enemy, and commitment to justice and peace. This is the Jesus story that forms the Church, but it is not the story that has formed religion and its role in an Irish culture of violence. We do have some serious reflection to do, not only on our culture of violence, but also on a more countercultural understanding of who Jesus is and the recovery of the radical Christology of non-violence and peace building.